is quite heavy, and there's 18 different pieces of legislation coming through that is going to feature in today's discussion. So very important legislation that kind of defines what we do as a council, I guess, and how we control our communities. But yeah, I'm not going to talk much more than that, and I'll hand over to Vibhuti and or Gavin, depending on who wants to kick off from staff.
I just say some introductory things, only that like Rob was just saying, it is a big piece of change that's coming through, and we'll try and whip through it as quickly as we can. The key idea being one, to appraise councillors of what's happening, and then just for you all to give any thoughts about where we see how the impact might be and what we want to say in the submission. So keen to hear from you all your thoughts around that. So that's the idea of the morning, and we'll try and, like I said, whip through some complicated things as quickly as we can. So I'll hand over to Gavin and Ashton.
Just before we go, though, just in terms of what we discussed was, if you've got questions, it's gonna be split into different topics. So if we wait till the end of each topic, and then we'll have question time at that point. So if you can just raise your hand, and I'll endeavour to chair it appropriately. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou. Thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Can I just check everybody can see the slides? All good? Okay. Yes, it is a mountain of
Sorry, Gavin. Sorry. I just wanted to say, I don't know if it's just me, but we can only see Ashton, not you. Might be worthwhile just shifting it a little bit so we can see the speaker.
There we go. Is that better?
No.
Not yet.
That's very odd, because on the
If you go to the chair next to you, that black thing, yeah, that one, we could see you. It just otherwise seems like a disembodied voice. Sorry.
The spirit of council speaking to you about all the wonders of the RM reform.
Yeah.
It should all reach.
Will the camera move?
Are we both visible now?
Yeah, except for one eye, but that's okay. We'll work with one.
Better now?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay.
I can see now.
All right, thank you. Yeah. All right. So yes, it's a lot of pieces of amended subordinate legislation. This is the national direction instruments under the RMA. So the resource management reform process has 3 phases. We're in the second phase of the process, and this is addressing a series of changes to the national direction instruments. So there are 4 new national directions and 10 amended. There's also a series of changes to the freshwater package, and then there's a third package called the Going for Growth Housing Package, which we're not going to deal with today. We've got a bit longer to consult on that one. It's a very limited consultation period that we've been central government set. 27th of July, I think, is our closing date. So we have just over a month in total. These changes to the national direction are interim measures. Effectively, they are the stopgap between the current RM system and the new RM system that the central government wants to bring in. And it's for them to really get some of their key government priorities in place within this first term of government. Phase 3 will be the introduction of the 2 new pieces of legislation on we call the Spatial Planning Act
And the Natural
and the
Environment Act.
National Environment Act. We'll get to see them later this year. I think probably around election time, which will also be challenging.
Which, implementation, if I may, the phase 2 portions of these bills are supposed to come into effect either on commencement, which means when they are finished, or at the end of the year roughly. So all of the things that we're going to be describing today are supposed to take effect in 2025 or the very near future.
So there are 3 packages in this that we're discussing today. The first one is package 1, which is infrastructure and development. The second one is package 2, which is primary industries, and we'll get to that shortly. And then the third one is the freshwater package, which we'll deal with quite briefly. I'll work through the set of changes and amendments in the infrastructure and development package first. And the first one of these is a new national policy statement for infrastructure that aligns with the government's intent to make the delivery of infrastructure simpler, faster, easier and more effective. Some of the key changes within it, social infrastructure is now being added. So it's no longer just roads, bridges, rail, power. It's also hospitals, fire stations, stormwater, which has benefits, but will also raise quite a number of challenges. There's a suite of considerations that have been introduced really to give infrastructure prominence and to recognise and enable the development of it and the benefits associated with it. This particular NPS does not cover renewable energy, electricity, transmission or networks, which are all covered by separate national directions, and we'll come to those. Consulting, I will go back one step. We have also been in discussion with other councils in Southland and Otago regions so that we're swapping information, talking to one another, getting an understanding of what the issues are generally. We've been doing that within the council staff as well. Our general staff comments is that this NPS is generally positive. It's got the potential to make the delivery of infrastructure easier. It certainly aligns with a greater emphasis on spatial planning. So this will, I assume, this will be much more visible when we see the Spatial Planning Act. The decision-making process around the infrastructure provision is quite robust, but we will need to undertake more analysis of the impacts for us. The biggest one that we see at this stage is the exemption of infrastructure from natural hazards consideration. So there's a new national policy statement on natural hazards being introduced, which explicitly excludes infrastructure from its consideration. So that could be quite challenging, particularly with the addition of social infrastructure. I can assume that part of the underlying thinking around this is that major infrastructure is generally built to a very high standard, and that coverage of natural hazards by local government in relation to major infrastructure is probably superfluous. I suspect that's part of the logic, but that's quite different when we're starting to talk about things like hospitals, fire stations or schools, which are part of the fabric of the community.
Yeah, and I'll touch on that last piece here just because of this is one of the areas we've identified. In the national policy statement, really what this bill or this amendments are trying to do is that often with these infrastructure pieces, there's a lot of competing national direction where there's a weighting process or a scale where decision makers are having to do all the things of all the concerns, the limits, all the things that could go wrong with the piece of infrastructure versus all the benefits. And what this does is it tips the scale on the benefit side quite a bit And one of those things is natural hazards is decreasing the amount of purview or the amount of analysis or review of that natural hazard on these infrastructure projects. And so what the national policy statement does as well is it comes with this idea of resilience, that we're going to make the consideration at the time the consent low, but then later on, if they want to upgrade or if they want to mitigate later on, then it's much easier to do, and that they will build the resilience after establishment potentially, or at least that's our current reading, which could pose as problematic.
Yeah.
So is there any questions on this piece before we move on to the next slide?
Christine?
Thank you. It may be early days, but I just wonder if the analysis and consideration of these proposed changes include any analysis of what might be any costs to the local bodies concerned in respect of time or staffing.
So thanks, Christine. We, in the sense that we are identifying where we think there will be more resource requirements from council, whether it's cost or people or time, we're trying to flag that. In terms of how much, no, we don't have that detail yet. But some of them clearly will require more action from us.
Yes, thank you.
Julie?
Thank you. The spatial planning that sounds like it's going to, we need it done yesterday. This is going to be coming in by the end of 2025.
The fact that we are doing it now is of considerable benefit to us. In terms of, does it need to be done yesterday? Probably not, because new infrastructure proposals take some time to develop. The government is working towards the Spatial Planning Act, so there would be a reasonable hope that they're lining those timings up. But as I say, the fact that we've started and we are pushing ahead with that puts us in a better position.
And I would like to respond to that, but the specifics on the National Policy Statement for Infrastructure, what the government has done is that it has provided a pathway or benefits that basically, if you've identified the piece of infrastructure in a spatial plan, there are more benefits and it's easier to consent and move forward because it's already been pre-identified. And so there's already kind of a pathway for that. But they provide an alternative pathway as part of this legislation that if it hasn't been identified, there's other steps that need to take place in order to get that through the consenting process. It doesn't necessarily mean, so there's a pathway either way. And I think that there's many councils out there that don't have a special plan in place yet. So they're providing for both.
Thank you.
Just brief.
Thank you. Gavin, if I understood correctly, you said exempting infrastructure from natural hazards consideration could also be because of the fact that infrastructure is built to such a high standard that
in discussions I was involved in before coming here, I know that is one school of thought.
Right, and that somehow doesn't make sense to me, because if it is being built to such a high standard, it should pass any consideration straight away. It shouldn't be an issue, should it?
No, it shouldn't be an issue if it's been built to a high standard and they are the designers.
They should be ticked off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Christine?
It's
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, this is a problematic area because it doesn't matter what level of resilience you would be building your infrastructure to. The issue is that, we don't exactly know what kind of hazards might come through and, to what extent or how extreme they might be. So and I'm sure when it comes in more detail, we'll look at it a bit more, but it will require us to do, like Ashton was saying, the balance is tipped towards providing more infrastructure. And I think I've heard the minister quote examples of, windmills taking a long time and energy solutions taking a long time, years in some cases. So that's what they're trying to streamline through this.
Thanks, Bertie. Christine?
Thank you. My question is just a follow on from Julie's, really, that you have talked about more emphasis on spatial planning, and what I've heard is regional spatial planning as well. And as a TLA, we're starting our own processes. So when we're talking about regional spatial planning, what is the difference, and is that happening alongside the spatial planning we are doing as a TLA?
At this point, we don't know exactly what the difference is, because that will be the subject of the Spatial Planning Act,
which was becoming roughly later this year.
Yeah, so we'll see that later this year. In discussion with planning managers around the two regions, the work that we're doing will feed in. So we're not going to lose anything of what we've done. The regional spatial planning will be in more detail and pick up some more things, and of course have a broader scope. But our input, the input we provide from the work we're doing, basically puts us one step ahead in that process.
And then second, I'd like to add on is we're not going to be talking further going for housing growth today, but that document is open for consultation right now. And inside that document, it outlines some very specific consultation questions on the details of those spatial planning plans. How much housing development should we have? How long in the future should that be? How much infrastructure should we have? How long in the future that should be? So there's more of that details part of that going for housing growth consultation package, which kind of tries to get at, they're opening up the consultation on what those spatial plans should entail and what should be the requirements of those spatial plans. So they're not set yet on the details of that, and that might be something that we feedback on later on as part of that consultation.
Christine, just a quick answer to what's different in regional versus what a TLM might be doing, having been involved in the regional spatial plan here in Wellington. What the government would be wanting to see is connection between where, say, Southland District is saying housing will grow versus what Invercargill might be saying, or what Gore might be saying. So, and from their perspective, if they're thinking state highways or schools or social aspects to things, they're wanting to see a more regional thing. I don't, to the point that Gavin and Ashton were saying, at a more practical level, when you actually go about and doing a regional spatial plan, you do have to look at communities by themselves. So therefore, it is as much an assimilation and conglomeration of different spatial plans as anything else. We are taking care that the overarching how population will grow, what businesses are thinking. We are looking at a more regional lens to that, and not just what's happening in Southland District. So that those are the kind of things that we should be looking broader, which we are anyway. If so that should be helpful, and we shouldn't have to redo any of that unless, and same with natural hazards and where pathways of rivers might be or what have you. So that should be helpful.
Yes, no, thank you. And you've kind of identified not wanting to redo what we've already done. And when the legislation comes out, it may offer more information on when we're talking regional, how that's led and what that looks like. Thank you.
I'll let you guys carry on in a sec. Just a quick question from me. The natural hazards excluding infrastructure, does that include flood banks and stop banks and that kind of thing, which could be classed as infrastructure but is related to natural hazards?
I don't have an answer to that one, but that has crossed my mind as well.
So in the additional infrastructure definition, so I'm getting into a little, this is getting into a little bit of too much specifics maybe, but in the additional infrastructure definition, which is part of this package, what we might call is like the natural hazard defense infrastructure is not really included. So for example, we're really looking at correction facilities, stormwater networks, district, regional resource wastewater defense facilities, defense facilities associated with the defense force, fire and emergency, hospitals, schools, institutions. So the infrastructure associated with protecting from natural hazard, from my current understanding, would not be included in that.
So that may be something that we raise in the response. I'll jump on to the second. So within the package one, there's a series of changes to the national directions around energy and electricity, amendments to the current energy national policy statements and national environmental standards. Generally supported. We haven't made we're not likely to make big comments on this one, but we note that outstanding natural landscapes will still remain a constraint on renewable energy generation. So as Ashton was talking about, the balance and the tension, that's one tension that will remain. And again, we'll be directed to explicitly recognise the benefits of renewable energy and to avoid any loss of renewable energy. Again, for things like SDC on Bakiura, those sorts of projects may be easier to implement, and it's coupled with changes to the Building Act. But I might ask Ashton to speak briefly. He's had a bit more of a detailed look at this one.
Yeah. So the changes coming from the renewable, the National Policy Statement for Renewable Energy, National Environmental Standards for Electricity Transmission, which are now changing to electricity networks, and the National Environmental Standards for emissions transmissions activities, telecommunication activities. There's a lot there. For the transmission and for the electricity networks, those are probably going to be ones that we don't look at in great detail. Those are ones that are specifically looking at utility networks and their operations and making that consistent throughout New Zealand. And so that's not something that we have a particular comment on. For the renewable energy, most likely these are looking at projects that are going through the fast track process through the EPA. So earlier this year, we had the Slope Down Wind Farm project, and we know that they were looking at those projects to determine why were those stopped by the fast track panels, what were the issues that were stopping them from going ahead, and looking at ways to improve that to either get through those fast track processes or to get through normal consenting processes. So we know that if these changes go through, it's more than likely that Southland's going to see increased renewable energy generation in the district, and that some of those larger projects might go through because the balance, again, is shifting towards benefiting those projects in more detail. For the communal and small community power generation, they're really trying to lessen on the building side the requirements for building consent for putting solar panels on homes and connecting in, allowing for higher voltage. And this would complement that on the other side to lessen, or for example, if there was a larger or medium-sized renewable energy project that was fit for a specific local community, they're trying to open up that pathway. So there's across the spectrum from small, medium to large, they're trying to open up the pathway completely. Is there any questions on that?
We can take that.
So you can carry on.
Yeah. Okay. Now, within infrastructure development, we have the new National Environmental Standard for Papakainga. The thrust of this instrument is that Papakainga is generally supported. It's streamlining the development for up to 10 Papakainga units on what the instrument defines as Maori ancestral land, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then, in some cases and in some areas, it's restricted discretionary or control.
Restricted discretionary.
Restricted discretionary consent will be available to allow up to 30 residential units. So what this will do is will allow for Papakanga development and some, so not just housing, but some associated development in residential, rural and Maori special purpose zones. From our reading of it at this stage, we would generally support the proposal. Again, natural open spaces zones and outstanding natural features and landscapes remain a constraint on this. And in this district, that could be that could create some problems or tensions. The other issue is the way that Maori ancestral land is defined in the standard. It sets quite a list of specific categories of land, and there may be some implementation issues around that, in the sense of how will we as council know which pieces of land are eligible to apply under this NES. It creates a new consent category, and so we will, relating to the earlier question, we're going to have some resourcing requirements to prepare that, do training and monitor this. We'll also have some detailed engagement with Tammy around the implementation, and I've already reached out to them to start setting that up. And again, I'll hand over to Ashton for some more detail or for questions if you have any.
I'll do 1 second of detail. So, because I know that we talked about resourcing, is that as part of this standard, the government is asking us explicitly to monitor how much of this Papakanga activity occurs after the implementation of this standard. And so there will be some additional, this may be through our annual monitoring surveys or more, of us feeding this information back to the central government, which might require some additional details and or resources as part of that.
And the one of the challenges with that will be that given that the intent is for up to 10 units to be permitted, some of these may occur without ever coming past council. So in order to, that will certainly raise a resourcing issue for us.
Yes.
Any questions?
Doesn't look like it.
Okay. All right. The new National Environmental Standard for minor residential units. The first thing I hope for is that they remove granny flats from the title. So the intent is to allow for one additional minor residential unit without resource consent for every principal residential unit. And this is paired up with changes to the Building Act. It sets a whole set of standard conditions for minor residential units to get the permitted status. And it will restrict the ability of council to control those in some areas of the district plan. Our general comments are that, in an overarching thing, it's hard to see it leading to a substantial change in housing availability, simply because of the conditions that the standard will set in order to be permitted, and that applies on the Building Act side of things as well. There's some conflicts with the district plan that we may require an outreach program sort of to developers and builders, or potentially a non-schedule 1 change. Meeting the conditions for permitted development can be quite high, so I expect that we will have some issues in terms of people expecting that they can do it and finding that they can't. Some of the things that it restricts us from controlling, for example, access. Now we already have issues in terms of ancillary buildings and uses and activities in the rural area that should have an upgrade to their road access but don't. This would exacerbate this. We've also identified that in the rural area we may have some issues where a single site may have a number of dwellings already that could be primary residential units, for example, workers' accommodation, workers' dwellings, and whether there is a loophole that then each of those could have a minor residential unit. So we could find a doubling of a number of dwellings on a site quite rapidly. And again, Ashton's had a good look at this. And do you have any specific points you want to raise?
I think one of our biggest concerns is basically how we calculate upgrades for roads. So, for example, often we have a roading hierarchy as part of the code of practice where it bases off the number of dwellings or the number of users, and then subsequently how many vehicles are going to be using that road over a given period of time. And if we have a lot of these permitted activities occurring where they don't provide parking, that means we're going to have more on-street parking, which could create some adverse effects there, which, for example, difficulty for emergency services getting to homes if specifically the access way is quite small. And then second is that if there's subsequent development based off of that, that could require that development to upgrade because now the amount of dwellings and people living on that road are much higher than the anticipated original activity. So there could be some real headaches for council in terms of how we manage that. And specifically, this legislation kind of stops us from taking a really sensible approach to that. And then the other thing that I would say is that some landowners, in terms of the quite high perspective, is that some landowners in our residential areas like Tiana or Riverton may want to engage in this activity and still find that they still have a resource consent. And so there's an education element with them as well in terms of the developers, in terms of what rules in the district plan apply when this goes into effect. And then from an education perspective to our communities of what's the rules and how does that work with our district plan, and so that they have clear expectations when they're trying to undertake this activity.
One of the parts of the district plan that will still continue to apply and which will trip a minor residential unit from permitted into requiring some form of consent will be natural hazards. So this is not something that's going to be able to be permitted in an area that's mapped in the district plan as affected by natural hazards.
You guys just want to quickly explain what non-Schedule 1 change means?
Yep. Non-Schedule 1 change is basically where we change the district plan without going through a plan change process. So sorry about that jargon there. We probably should have removed that. But as part of this national direction, we can make amendments to our district plan in order to align our district plan with those higher order documents like this granny flap bill. And so we might have to make a change, like we could put in a note, or we could change the provision entirely so that there's no conflict, so that the amount of education or amount of work we have to do with the community is lower, or it's more clear on which takes effect. And there will be some direct conflicts with these amendments that we may have to consider doing that. And that requires an outreach. It's not as robust as a plan change, but that might require some outreach to let people know that we are modifying the district plan.
And this one's going to come into immediate effect, I think.
I believe so.
Yeah. So this is one of the proposed amendments that will come into immediate effect. So as soon as it's made, this process will be accessible.
Yeah.
Any questions on that one?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I think, or a comment to start with, but I think there's a real risk with this, that the perception in the community of the enablement piece and the differentiation between a resource consent and a building consent could create some tension in the community where the government says they can do it, and then they think that they can do it and actually realise that they still need a building consent to carry it out. And then the question that I've got, and I'm looking into a bit of a crystal ball here, but I'm just thinking ahead in terms of if we were to implement anything around short-term accommodation, and the very small number of mechanisms that we've got to control that, could this override anything our ability, because these sorry, they're not called granny flats anymore, but minor residential units could be used as Airbnb type setups. And does this overrule any constraints that we might be able to do down the track, whatever that might be?
I'll jump in on that. So there was two parts to that. So I want to talk about the Building Act side of things first, and then I'll go to the visitor accommodation issue second. So earlier this year, the government pushed through changes to the Building Act that would pair with these minor residential units for granny flats. That would be exempted works underneath the Building Act. So I believe the council submitted on the Building Act side of these granny flats already. And so we're looking at our submission and pairing that with the previous comments associated with the Building Act. So the government's intent is that both the Building Act and the RMA, there would be exemptions from both. And so therefore they could go through it without a consent. Now, on the topic of visitor accommodation,
just one sec, Ash. Just 1 second, Ashton, sorry. Rob, there is the point you're raising about the disconnect between what the government's saying is an easy road to do anything and actually the requirement, because I have been speaking to the building team as well, is an education piece that we will need to do. And they've got it in mind that, as soon as this gets confirmed, we need to start saying things like, and have a fact sheet that says it's not as easy. So yes, there's definitely that required, and we've already talked about it, and we will need to do something alongside that. So there is a very real risk that people will say council is doing this. And actually, the provisions are not as enabling in the Building Act as possible. The submission that we did from the building perspective, I'm just trying to think through, did say that, please make clear, give us the exact templates that you want us to follow. And there were things like that, and bring more clarity to the part where people will need consents or not. So we have submitted that already and asked for that. Thank you. Sorry, Ashton, back to you.
Oh, no, thank you for that clarity, Vibhuti. So on the issue of visitor accommodation inside the Resource Management Act is a very interesting activity because it can both be the construction of a structure for visitor accommodation, and it could also be the activity that occurs within a residential activity. So for example, I build a home, my family lives in it, and then I leave that home, and now I'm renting that out for Airbnb. And so now it goes from being a dwelling to a visitor accommodation activity. What these regulations really focus on is the building of the structure portion of that. So we would have to do more analysis, and I think this is a really good topic that we should probably add to our submission, is that what this really governs is the construction of the building. If they change the use after the construction of the building, there's nothing in the proposed amendments that would prohibit us from adding on new regulations that could govern what that activity has to do. So I think we should request that clarity. I think that's a really good point.
Rob, was your question more that if we want to put or allow worker accommodation, will this ease the pathway? Is that what your question's geared towards?
Kind of, it's kind of both, like the ease of pathway for the worker accommodation, like if you look at Te Anau in particular, but then also the challenges that we're facing in Te Anau from a lot of that sector pushing back on the Airbnb type stuff. And if we are going to try and put some parameters in, and I don't know what those might be, even if we do them, but does this kind of supersede or overrule or provide another avenue for people to kind of bypass anything that we try and do, any mechanisms we try and put in place to manage that activity?
Sure. So that second part, like Ashton's saying, we could check on whether it will allow more. Probably, yeah, it will depend on a few factors, because there are consenting rules around it, like I said. So it might actually not be as easy as we might have thought.
I think one of the other reasons for dropping the term granny flats is that a very clear part of this is that there's no longer any restrictions or parameters about whether the people living or visiting in the minor residential unit have a connection to the people living in the primary residential unit. So it's no longer about building a small outbuilding for a member of the family to live in. It's just about a process for building an additional residence. So in that sense,
so,
yes, it would aid it.
Yeah, in that sense, it'll allow more Airbnb type, and we might just need to think about what provisions we could put in if we were wanting to restrict that to a certain extent somewhere. And can we even do that? Or might just be something we need to look into.
Thanks for that, Christine.
Thank you. So I understand what you were saying is that this becomes enabling straight away, and that resource consent is not needed and there's changes to the Building Act. But you talked, I think, just about the natural hazards still applies. So in terms of our recent discussions, and yet to occur more of those, around the Section 73 implications, what happens here? What's the process that follows where this an option for families might occur to do this, but it's in a flood-prone area?
Okay. I know we talked with the building team about that initially. Do you recall there?
I mean, that might be something that we might need to get back to you with more clarity. In terms of the natural hazards, the current regulations basically say that we can provide a more stringent rule on natural hazards if these are located in those areas. So in that case, they might still go through a resource consent. That consent still might be a bit easier than it is now, but we might have to get back into the specifics of that.
Okay, thank you. Because sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, Christine, overarchingly, the Section 73 rule requirement will not change. So we can, if the only question would be if they can get through without actually requiring a consent at all. So there are some provisions. In a lot of cases, my understanding from the building team is actually they'll be requiring consents, even if it's a simple enough consent. So if it actually comes in through that provision, we could apply the Section 73 rule. But if it doesn't, if a granny flat or a minor residential unit is being built without any consent, then they could build and we wouldn't be able to apply anything because we wouldn't even know. Would be the thing. Yeah.
Yes, but it could be if they're building a minor residential unit and at the same time apply for resource consent to make some changes to the principal dwelling. They may not get resource consent to make the changes to the principal dwelling because of the natural hazard risk.
That's right. Yeah. So it can get picked up that way. But most of the idea about minor residential is to be able to do that with least amount of consent, or, the easiest path, which is no consent. So yeah, we can, hopefully, but we might just need to look into that, whether we can catch it at a resource consent perspective time. So we'll bring that back and just check what is in there.
I think from an implementation perspective, we will, and as Vivitti was saying about the education and promotional work beforehand, we will, I'm sure, strike instances where people simply say, well, this is enabled now and I'm going ahead, and we don't know about it until some other resource consent or neighbour or some other thing brings it to our attention, and we'll probably have some post-building issues to deal with. So that's one of the potential risks.
Yes.
And it's interesting because I touched on this in Christchurch when I was talking to the DIA when they were talking about this, and I asked him when he was talking about the natural hazards piece, and I said, well, how does that tie in with Section 73s? And he said, well, that's an MB thing, not my job, not our department.
Goodness.
the siloed nature of this work kind of comes through, and it does have those inherent risks that have been touched on.
Mm.
Matt,
Yes,
you've got a
well,
question? Oh, sorry. You go
no, that's
first.
fine. I'll catch up later. Thanks.
Matt?
Yeah, cheers. I'll just for clarity, because looking at when they were consulting on these changes, there was, I guess, rhetoric around not requiring a building consent either. So in the scenario of you've got a residential house, residential zone land, already a dwelling, already connected to services, building a simple dwelling, kind of similar to the 30 square meter rule at the moment of you can build a structure with no building consent, no resource consent. And this was to enable it to 70 with also amenity connections without building consent. Has that changed in this process since the consultation, that even in that scenario, it would still require building consent? I guess
It's
my
not,
understanding of the intention was that it would encourage areas where small minor dwellings could be kind of put onto areas where there's already dwellings, to not require that cost to encourage those minor dwellings to be built. But
yeah, no,
obviously that's going to put pressure on.
that hasn't changed, Matt, but what I was saying was that in the detail, it's not as easy as it sounds. There are still quite a few things requirements that you have to meet, and if you don't, then that leads you towards a consent. I don't
Right.
have all the nitty-gritty details of what it is, but when our building team looked at it, that was the one thing, and we submitted on that we don't want this to come back on councils. We don't want to be left holding the baby and then going all the blame to fall on us, because they actually haven't enabled it as much as the headline said.
Yeah.
So the
'Cause-
headline and the detail has a disconnect is the point.
Because the original kind of talk was more about what would be the framework and the engineering standards and reports that would then need to still be submitted, but it almost felt like that would be submitted somewhere else other than council, and once everything's done and dusted, you just let council know what you've done. The pressure that I kind of saw in that, like you've highlighted, is more road use, and keeping up with that demand, but more so increased toilet pans being connected to the wastewater without actually that growth being known about, because it's not been caught in that consent process. So there's obviously more to come, more detail to come when these, like, is there NES out for reading, or is this just what's indicated?
So it's a very difficult position that we're in. So as part, we might have sent you a document where it had the links to these attached provisions. So in attachment 1.6 of the proposed package 1, it goes through the proposed provisions there, but they're very light and they're not in bill format. So they're not going to open it up to consultation again. This is the one chance we get to see. This is the amount of detail that we get to see. And then afterwards, they're going to move forward with the bill.
So where do we find that? I'm just trying to read more into it. Where do we find what's been announced, the package?
All right, Fiona, sorry, Matt. I know you put the presentation on the hub. Did you put the other Word document on as well? We will make sure that we did a Word document with our draft recommendations, and at the end of the document are links to all of the proposed changes.
Yeah, we'll make sure to send that through.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that's on the hub.
Oh yeah, I found it there now. Cool, cheers.
Okay. All right, I'll move on to the next. Okay, so still within infrastructure, and now we're at the National Policy Statement for Natural Hazards. Key matters, not changes because they're new. Key introductions are, it introduces a proportionate risk-based approach, and to give a little bit of explanation of that, that's in contrast to a precautionary risk-based approach, which is really where our system has been based to date. It directs that councils must use best available information about natural hazards, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It sets a fixed number of mandatory hazards that council must consider. So there's 7. It leaves out a number of others, and probably the most significant one we're concerned about is wildfire. As I said earlier, infrastructure and primary production activities are excluded from controls. There's a minor typo in that point. Because it's a national policy statement, there's no immediate change to the district plan, but it will begin to affect our assessment of resource consent applications. In terms of our comments or the direction we'll be going, because councils will be required to use best available information, that means we're going to have to incorporate new natural hazard data as part of the resource consent as that information becomes available. There's some inconsistencies between housing, commercial and industrial activities in terms of the consideration of hazards. Excluding infrastructure and farming activities may be problematic, particularly around some forms of social or additional infrastructure. And again, this is one that is very clearly presented as an interim measure prior to the full legislation becoming available. But because of the timing, this is going to apply at least for 2 to 3 years and perhaps longer. Ashton, did you have some other points?
Yeah, I think the best available information is going to be a very difficult one, I think, for us in terms of a consenting authority, because on our district plan, we have the natural hazard overlays, which are clearly identified, where an applicant might see that and go, I don't know, natural hazard is not applicable to me. And then once they get to the consenting stage, because we have that information, and technically because it's not gazetted, we can't put it in the map. We say you are subject to a natural hazard, and now you must go through these hoops, which might be difficult. The other point that I would like to raise is that this really, because this only applies to discretionary non-complying activities, because that's when we really take into effect the national policy statements. For our residential activities that are occurring within our residential areas, you could develop a house in a natural hazard area because it's permitted. So therefore you don't consider this. But if you were to establish a cafe, which might be a discretionary activity, they would have to do all the works required to mitigate for that hazard. And so there's this very inconsistent approach, kind of just building on that second bullet, where people who are placed immediately adjacent to each other might have very different outcomes when they come to us as a consenting authority. And we see that as being, again, we could be blamed for having a very inconsistent approach when this is the direction from the central government.
The other aspect is that proportionate is not clearly defined at the moment. We can gain some idea of what it means, is that the level of, let's say, the level of conditions that we might place on a consent decision should be relative to the impact of the risk on the proposed activity or development. But that provides a flexible approach, but it also provides a lack of clarity. So that's one of the key issues we're going to face.
Is there any questions on that?
I've got John and then Christine.
Yeah, no, I don't actually have a question, Rob. It's solved.
Christine?
Thank you. My question was just around best available information. So is that a quality test, and who applies that?
Yes. So the meaning of best available is not clearly defined, and who determines that. As it's worded at the moment, it would be up to council, and I can foresee that being contested.
So I need to provide a little bit of clarity here. I'm going to read a note from the central government on this. It might just be better to understand their perspective on it so that we can clearly understand their perspective. So let me read this note. Data and information related to natural hazards risk is always changing and improving. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, for councils to have perfect hazard and risk data and information. Allowing the use of best available information enables local authorities to progress with natural hazard management through a proposed NPS-NH with inputs that are available at the point in time, as opposed to delaying management until, and this is in quotes, better information is available and accessible. The intent is that this will also protect local authorities from legal challenge related to data and information. So I think reading that and just sort of providing my own interpretation of it is that the burden is on us to what we think the best available information is, but the clear direction from the central government is that when we receive the information, we implement it even though we might consider that it's not perfect or it may have flaws. And they're really trying to push us to use the most recent information that we receive.
And just reflecting on the note that Ashton read out, what was the bit about data and information?
Oh, that it's always changing and improving, and it makes it difficult and often impossible to have perfect data.
Yeah, so there's a comment in there that we shouldn't be held up because the data is not the best or better. That's fine as an intent, but in practice, and this may change with the new legislation, in practice, if it becomes the subject of a hearing or a legal challenge, you're talking about evidence, and evidence has to be robust. So we could be in a pushed in two directions.
Yes, I see this as being quite a problematic area because we're required to, as we've had recent discussions, to be aware of that and provide that information. Yet it could be, it's a subjective test, isn't it?
As we discussed with that, the other issue, there's the position of knowing something and sharing what we know and applying something to a decision about property.
Yeah, and again, I'll read one more note just to kind of, I think that will stamp this point. So the central government states, local authorities should take all practical steps to improve information and to consider the validity of their data for the intended planning purposes when considering any deficiencies with it. So what they're really trying to say is improve your processes, get it as best as where you can, and if it has deficiencies, try your best.
And this is also in the context that up to now, largely the responsibility for gathering that data has sat with the regional council, but this is very much putting that putting the onus on all councils and on us.
Rob, just before you go to Councillor Wilson, I just wanted to say to Gavin and Ashton that we're 1 minute out from 10 o'clock. So just mindful of what you've got. So yeah, just fine.
Thank you.
Excellent. And a quick comment from me just before I pass on to Matt is I've never heard a judge accept I tried my best as a binary legal outcome in a case of challenge. Matt?
I think that's kind of what Gavin was just mentioning around the obligations being traditionally with regional council on this, and I guess some frustration over the last few years of trying to figure out where better information is coming from as far as, say, the natural hazard overlays. We've got our maps in the district plan, but everything's indicating that those lines are not necessarily the true natural hazard identification. With this new package and the comment of implementing regional spatial plans, has there been anything in that about part of that regional spatial planning piece having a natural hazard component to it? I guess in my eyes, it's kind of like step one.
Yeah, it's critical.
But is that written in there, and does that maybe suggest that it's going to put some pressure on regional councils to get that natural hazard information up to best that can be done?
So I'll quickly respond to this because I know, again, we're sensitive on time. The central government has indicated as part of the Natural Environmental Act and the Spatial Planning Act that regional council will be responsible for environmental limits, including the identification of natural hazards as part of that spatial plan.
Okay, yeah, that answers it. Yeah, it's just that risk of not doubling up the work too, but obviously it'd be all a lot easier if it was a unitary.
All right, I'll move on. Okay, so we're in the second package of changes, primary sector. I'll go through a couple of these, which we don't have much comment on at the moment. So amendments to the stock exclusion regulations 2020, we really haven't looked at that at all yet. We don't think that it will be in our purview. There's various provisions across several NPS regulations being changed essentially to enable mining and quarrying. Quarrying activities are defined very broadly, and they're also identified as an infrastructure supporting activity, which potentially then lines them up with the NPS for infrastructure. We've got further consideration to do on that one, but yeah, that could have significant impacts.
Quick comment on for me, a lot of these are very technical in nature. Looking at regulatory alignment across several pieces of secondary legislation. So this is very in the weeds, and we just need to do more analysis here.
So I've got the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement in this primary sector package, and also a new National Environmental Standard for Marine Aquaculture. Oh, sorry, amendments to the NES for marine aquaculture. Really, these two parts go together. So this is about NZCPS making some changes to the policies to enable priority activities. This particularly flows on from the case in Otago, with Port Otago, and the need for some infrastructure to be in the coastal marine zone. That does dovetail with NES marine aquaculture. We're generally supportive of the proposed changes. Not sure whether we are going to submit on either of these. Ashton, you had a couple of points you wanted to make.
Yeah, so just like the renewable energy considerations, a lot of these aquaculture projects are going through the fast track process. So most likely, you might have been aware of the Hananui aquaculture project. That was the Stewart Island aquaculture application that was denied in 2023. So the government was looking at projects like those and trying to figure out how to create amendments to get those over the line. So most likely that if we see that going through a new fast track process with these amendments, that might lead to a different outcome.
Can I just suggest for that aquaculture piece that you touch base with Bobby Brown at Great South, who's doing a whole lot of work in that space at the moment, and will have quite a good grasp of some of the impacts and some of the pieces that it might be an opportunity for some of her findings to come through in the submission.
Yep, we can do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, our favourite, amendments to the NESCF, commercial forestry. The one that we have spoken of before, the removal of council to have more stringent rules for afforestation, as well as some additional removal of some other afforestation replanting requirements and reductions in slash provisions. Ashton's done a lot of work on this one. Key issues being around our position that we should retain some control within the NESCF. There needs to be means of limiting or prohibiting wilding species, better recognition of regional issues, and the retention of afforestation and replanting plan requirements. Essentially, the changes will remove the requirement for forestry activities to provide council with a forestry management plan. That makes any type of enforcement incredibly difficult. And we've also been, Ashton's also been looking at this in alignment with two sets of changes to the emissions trading scheme. All of these things are kind of bundled together. I'll let Ashton talk briefly about this.
Yes, I will try to speak very briefly and then open it up to questions. We've put together a very robust submission so far on this topic. We have recommended 14 different points for the central government and trying to support that as best that we can, all with the idea of trying to improve how forestry is done in our district and provide some explanations for why we believe that. So I'll stop there and then open it up for questions.
Thanks. This is a real big one for us, as you've touched on, and it scares me when I see removal of ability for council to introduce rules, and it certainly doesn't match the expectation of the community who are expecting us to be able to implement rules. So yeah, this is going to be a very challenging one. Has anyone got any questions?
Just a comment that this is quite disappointing to see this.
I agree. Yeah.
So are we able to push back and share that sentiment as part of our submission?
I'll talk a little bit more on the detail of the submission. So as part of the work as council staff, we also submitted recently on the climate change reduction amendment trading scheme amendment bill, which is a huge mouthful, that was the farm forestry limitation, where they were limiting the registration of forestry to 25% of a farm. So we submitted on that with some improvements. We made some comments there. We made comments earlier in the year about the default carbon table calculations to improve that. And then as part of this submission, we're bringing in all of those considerations to say, the council is very unhappy with the direction. We would like to see these things introduced. So, for example, we provide them alternatives that if the central government is set on setting these forestry standards at a national level, that it should create an authority to develop regional and sub-regional standards and approaches, that if they want to retain control, then we should still have the ability to feed in. We talk about, for example, the need for regional variance, the need for evidence-based policy development. So the central government we're removing our ability to restrict this activity, even though no council has used these provisions inside the NESCF. So there's no evidence that their councils are being overly stringent, and there's no evidence that that this is overly limiting the industry at all. And so this is a precautionary step on behalf of the central government, and we ask them to delay that until there's proof that councils are overly limiting this activity and being overly burdensome. And so we kind of go through the entirety of the change and try to outline all of our concerns.
So in essence, to Rob's question, we're saying, yes, we are pushing back, and we'll just, if we haven't strengthened the words enough, obviously council wants us to, so we'll just look at that and push back a bit more. But well, we are pushing back on that overarchingly and bringing together the previous submissions as well.
Do we need some evidence-based stuff around, maybe evidence is the wrong word, but some sentiment-based stuff around, like the Wilding Pine Trust out in Northern Southland and all that kind of stuff to help support the submission, or are we just keeping it relatively high level?
It could be helpful, Rob. So, Gavin, if we haven't already, we should touch base with Rob or just see. I think you were there at that meeting, weren't you, Gavin?
No, Gavin was.
Oh, you weren't there.
Rob has given me the folder, and Ashton and I both read it. So yes, we're working on that.
Yeah, so we could
as well.
Yeah, we should grab, if we can, a letter or something to say, why some parts of the community really want us to control this, and that would just be helpful. And yeah, as support for our submission.
I think one of the key problems is that, speaking of evidence, the analysis that we have seen driving this is really one-dimensional in terms of the economic impact. It's just focused around maximising ETS without necessarily addressing any of the wider economic impacts of the afforestation. So,
and then I will just add to that we are making this submission. It is supported by evidence.
Yeah, but it'll just sentiment is sometimes useful. We can, as a counterbalance, we can use that.
Right.
Yeah, we'll look into it definitely, Rob.
Cool, thank you.
All right. Next. The other biggie, amendments to the NPS on highly productive land. Key matters, removal of land use class 3 from, not removal of land use class 3 from highly productive land, but the removal of restrictions on land use class 3 within the development sphere. Potential introduction of special agricultural areas, considering suspending or delaying the requirement for regional council to map highly productive land, and additional consultation on land use capability mapping. From our perspective, we certainly support the exemption of LUC 3 from the restrictions on development, and the removal of LUC 3 from the criteria for mapping highly productive land. We support the introduction of additional criteria for special agricultural areas. And again, reflecting on the discussions with neighbouring councils, Central Otago is pushing very hard to ensure that special agricultural areas can include land classes 4, 5, 6 and others, because that's of particular importance to them. Special agricultural areas shouldn't be applying to pastoral land or forestry. It's critical horticultural or locations or similar. As the key, Ashton, do you have anything else?
No, I mean, not unless there's any questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool, looks like you can carry on.
All right, freshwater package. The freshwater package is as big as the rest of it on its own. So some of the key directions in it, enabling commercial vegetable growing, addressing water security and storage, simplifying wetland provisions, simplifying fish passage regulation, some remaining issues with farmer-facing regs, and then mapping requirements for drinking water sources. At this point, we have looked at the wetlands provisions section primarily. It's an interesting one. It might trigger some increase in consent processing or require plan changes. But on the positive side, it removes induced wetlands, takes away the mandatory mapping, and there's a farming activities pathway. So it's a bit of a plus and minus. We're not clear whether we will submit on this at this stage. The other part of it that I want to have a bit more of a look at is the mapping requirements for drinking water sources. That may have some implications for our communities and spatial planning. Questions on that one? And that wraps it up. As I say, we've got the Going to Growth housing package that we will also have to have a look at. And I suspect we might have to organise another workshop on, depending on the issues that are in there. The main issue is the lack of time for proper consideration for such a big package of changes. Our submission will identify key points. For some of the instruments, we'll provide detailed responses, such as the NESCF. From what I've seen from other councils, we're largely in alignment. At the moment, we've got limited information, particularly for the implementation phase. So we know that there will be some resource implications. I guess the main issue is that without detailed implementation information, that's difficult to quantify. There are both good and bad points for Southland, so we will highlight the ones we're supportive of as well. NESC is probably our biggest bear because it's happening in the context of these other ETS changes. It's an interim measure and it indicates where the legislation is going to go. So following the introduction of the legislation, we'll understand longer term what we're facing.
Oh, thank you. It's that was a worthwhile presentation, and you guys have clearly got a good understanding of all of this change that's coming at you at 100 miles an hour from all different directions, and keeping on top of it can't be easy. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Does anyone have any kind of pressing questions at the tail end of this? Matt?
Just one about the type 3 land use on highly productive. I was trying to get some clarity the other day about it. When they're removing class 3, is that removing the regulations and provisions that affect class 3, or are they removing that category completely? And in which case, if they're removing it, where does that land end up? Does it fall into 2 or no category?
Okay, yeah, no, my wording wasn't quite clear. They're removing the regulations and provisions. So in the NPS HPL, as it will be amended, the restrictions that are there at the moment will only apply to classes 1 and 2. It won't apply on classes 3 to 10. And presumably it would apply to any of the special agricultural areas should they be developed.
So that's quite significant for us, isn't it? As far as like surrounding Winton and Lumsden and Balfour and all that. Yeah.
Yes. Significant for us. It's very significant for Gore. Most of Gore district is NEC3. So
we are expecting a surge in resource consents after this is implemented, where we see subdivisions from people in the district who've been waiting for this to go through unlodged in rapid succession.
So again, there's one of those resource implications that our resource consent team might get hammered for a little while with subdivisions that have been backed up waiting for this change. Certainly beneficial to our spatial planning as well.
Yeah, I think that spatial planning piece, and like you touched on at the start, is good that we've started that nice and early, and it's going to help to feed into this as, once again, the plane gets built while it's being flown. It's a cliche, but it's one that just keeps getting used because it's the environment that we're working in, which makes everyone's lives quite hard. And it's disappointing to see some of those changes going away from local control, which I think everyone in the country is almost asking for as well. It's that kind of that real equilibrium between that broad brush approach of trying to make things easier, but the unintended consequences that come out as a result that we all pay for later on. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be in this space, isn't it?
Yes.
Did you have anything you wanted to say before we wrap it up? Anything you wanted to add, Bertie?
No, thank you, Rob. All good.
Cool. Oh, well, thanks very much, Gavin and Ashton. And I assume we'll see a little bit more and potentially another workshop. I do have one final question for you. With the housing one, is that still tiered into tier 1, 2, and 3 councils, or is that more holistic?
So the national policy statement for urban development did not see any change as part of this package.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, both.
Okay, I'll stop sharing, and do I need to remind someone, was the recording stopping at this point, or you wait?
I know, we'll carry that on.
All right. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ashton. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
So just while we've got you in the room, and apologies that you only got this email last night. I incorrectly assumed that everyone had seen them and then found out that you had it. So remiss of me, and I've punished myself for the lack of warning for you on these remits, but they are pretty straightforward from looking at them.
Can you see them?
Yep, thanks, Fiona. So we've got the AGM coming up next week. We will be voting on these on behalf of council. We get, I think, 3 votes in total because of the size of our council. There's 5 of them on the document that you've got, but remit number 1, if you've been following the news lately, has 4 of them. Remit number 1 is null and void because it's already come through as part of the remuneration authority changes. So that's a null and void. So we start at number 2, and so this one here is that LGNZ advocate to the government for A, legislative change to make the joint management agreement mechanism more accessible for councils to use with iwi hapu, and B, for the provision of technical, legal and financial support to facilitate the use of joint management agreements for joint council and iwi hapu environmental governance, and C, for a mechanism such as JMAs to be included in the government's new resource management legislation that we've just been talking about. I struggled to understand what this actually was when I first read it. I'm assuming it's essentially TAMI, Te Ao Marama, which we've had in place for probably close to 30 years now and going quite well. So I don't really see this being relevant to us, but does anyone have any thoughts, comments, feedback?
So, sorry, it might be useful, Rob, in other places where they don't have a TAMI sort of arrangement, councils will enter into these JMAs. I know at Waipa they did that, in Hamilton they did that with Tainui, at Waitomo they did that with Manipuro. So they would enter specific JMAs. Yeah, and like you say, not exactly relevant for here because we've got the entity TAMI where we work with them. But yeah, and the thing about introducing in resource management legislation, when you introduce something into legislation, then without actually fully working through the implications of it, there can be some issues around that. So I know that with there is a, and the name will escape me, so I leave it, but there is already a provision of partnership with iwi, and I know even TAMI are closely looking at, and it's quite stringent. It's already there in the RMA. So yeah, that can cause some. I'm not saying issues, but it just need to be worked through.
And it'd be interesting to add that into the current mix of everything in the RMA at the moment with that discussion that we've just had. And I think part of this as well, and I might be wrong here, but some of the complexities with councils dealing with multiple iwi, whereas we've just got Ngāi Tahu, so it's a lot easier for us as well. Christine?
Sorry, I've come on my phone now because some kind people have turned off the power right outside my house. They've come back again, so I'm presuming they're turning it on. But I wonder if it's worth just having a discussion with Tami before we go to LGNZ to get their view on what this might mean. I think, doesn't it say there was only 2 in New Zealand? And it'll be useful to be able to express their view. Thank you.
Very good idea. Thanks, Christine. So are we kind of comfortable to take a bit of a steer from Te Ao Marama to where we kind of sit on this? I mean, I'm almost thinking, is this one where we abstain because it doesn't really relate unless sort of TAMI has a different view, but is there anyone with a strong view in either direction for supporting or not supporting this, based on what Christine's got a suggestion? Well, I'll take silence as acceptance. Oh, Julie, sorry.
Yep. Well, I was just going to say, I think that I agree with Christine that actually we should probably check in with them before we start making comments. Would be a wise thing to do, maybe.
Cool. Fiona, we can see your screen, whatever you're doing.
Oh no, sorry. Have you got it back?
We can see ourselves on top of the, thank you, it's back now. Cool, thanks, Julie. So the other second to last one is the alcohol licensing fees. So this is that LGNZ advocates for the government to update the sale and supply of alcohol fees regulation to account for inflation and include a mechanism for automatic annual inflation adjustments. So as most of you will probably be aware, the licensing fees are actually set in Wellington, so we have no say in what they actually are. We do have to charge them based on the Alcohol Act, but we don't have any say in what they are. So that comes through in our fees and charges, but we aren't able to adjust them. And I guess some councils, or the Far North District Council, is saying that they'd like to inflation-proof those fees. Any strong thoughts, feedback on that one? Can still see your screen, Fiona? Oh, yeah, it's back.
I'm surprised. There was something in the paper about having a it's an alcohol fees bylaw, because I thought they were quite expensive as they are.
Yeah, well, that's the feedback that I've been getting from that
Yeah.
sector that are having to pay
Yeah.
them. I think they'd be able to push back from our community if they were going up.
Yeah, which do we know whether we're covering our costs on that, or is it costing us money?
I believe, based on the annual plan process and everything that we've just gone through, where we've set those fees and charges, I mean, there wasn't any feedback from staff that those were too low, but I mean, we don't really have the say to change that, so they may not have commented. And I don't know if the Booty's got any thoughts on that.
I don't, Robert. We can definitely, I can check with the team. I know from experience that will probably be barely cost recovering from my experience in other places. So it will definitely, or we're not allowed to. But if you're losing much, then I guess would be your sort of, we can say yes. And it is a CPI increase. So I can check.
Yeah, I think what I might do is, like, based on the previous one as well, is we're going to get some additional information from both of these now. So I'll email you all with the outcome of that information and where I think the steer is, and then we can, if we need to discuss it further, we can. But otherwise, we can sort of take that approach. Christine.
Hey, thank you. I don't think that ratepayer should be subsidising the cost of the service. So I would be supporting the review of the fees and charges to ensure that we're recovering the cost of providing the service.
Yeah, no, that's I agree with you there. Thank you. There's nothing further on that one. I will move to the final one in the list, which is the interesting one, aligning public and school bus services. So it's proposed by Nelson. And that LGNZ advocate for the reform of the Ministry of Education funded school bus services to provide an improved service for families and to better integrate the services with council provided public transport services, including the option of public transport authorities, e.g. regional and unitary councils, we're not one of those yet, managing such services with appropriate government funding, noting that councils better know their communities and the potential to reduce congestion from better bus services for schools and the efficiency gains realised from integrating these two publicly funded bus services in the outdated and inflexible rules of the current centralised school bus system. So, I mean, we don't have any public transport in Southland at all, so it's not really relevant, but I guess it comes down to a principal point of view as to whether we want to support or not. So you've got your hand up, Matt?
Yeah, originally when I was reading this, I was thinking the same thing. If it's not really relevant, but then realised it's potentially something really enabling. We don't have a public bus system. We have plenty of school buses and plenty of tourism buses, and if all those buses driving around on our roads could also provide better public transport options for the communities, then that would be a great future. So as an enabling piece, I kind of think, well done, Nelson. This looks like a good idea that could in future, mean, Waikaia to Balfour bus kind of, and maybe the kids on the school bus will have to behave themselves because there's some older generations sitting there going to do their shopping.
Yeah, I see Darren's just chatted that he agrees with you. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We've got a lot of tourist buses on the road, but also we lost our intercity as well. You know, we don't get those connections that we used to have. So I think there'd be, you know, if there was even elements of that where, you know, you could have some sort of integration, I think it's something we should support.
Thanks, Sarah. Christine?
Yes, I think it talked in there about running a pilot. I would like to see full information coming back from that pilot, and I think consideration of the unintended consequences that might be there. I'm not sure I see that as a core business of council, although public transport sits with the regional council. And it may well have implications for cost to the ratepayers that we're unaware of. So I applaud the fact that there's been discussions with the Ministry of Education. I think they would be more than happy to pass that responsibility over to regional councils, but would need to understand why that would be. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. And I think if we look forwards to where we're proposing to go, if we do become a unitary, then this might actually fall into our kind of our knitting, I suppose, and touching on Matt's point, where we see an opportunity to maybe provide a service that's not there, and actually there might be some demand for that, Julie.
It's a minefield. Having been involved with trying to, at a board of trustee level of organising bus routes around here, yes. But anyway, yep, we know our communities, so I suppose we could work through it.
So when you say it's a minefield, no, I can, I've heard some horror stories of those school bus routes in the past. So do you still kind of support it in principle, or are you thinking stay clear?
It's a dirty job. Someone's got to do it, I suppose. But you know, there's it would be interesting. A pilot would be really interesting to see whether we can actually create better linkages. I'm sort of struggling to see it when we don't have any bus routes where a lot of these are going anyway. So
it has come up at some sort of public meetings that I've been involved in over the years, and I'm talking quite a few years now, around particularly what Matt touched on, with you've got a school bus going all the way from Garston through to Lumsden with a bus driver that's then waiting until 3 o'clock with an asset of an empty bus sitting there to then take the kids back home, and could that be utilised during the day? So I think there could actually be some opportunities in there going forward. So yeah, it probably is worth having a look at, even though it won't really impact us much yet, but it may do in the future.
Yes, well, from that point of view, I can see that, there's potential. Being able to have public and children on the same bus is probably a good idea too. But whether that's permitted, I'm not sure.
Yeah, given the drivers probably have to go through police checks and everything to be able to do it, it might be.
And do the adults and kids, or does everybody have to go through a police check to make sure that they're all hunky dory?
Cool. So what I'll do is I'll talk to the talk to our marama, and we'll talk to the alcohol fees team as well, and I'll email you all back the outcome of that, and then and a kind of a steer from what I've picked up on today. And then if anyone has any allergic reaction to where we think we're going to go with them. One thing that we did talk about after the last one was the ability for those present, based on further information that comes up, to kind of change the view of what we agreed on at the day. Today. Are you guys comfortable with that, or do you want us to stick to the hard and fast what we've agreed on today? Comfortable?
Yeah, well, it's always if you get more information or you see something different, you've got to be able to change your mind.
Yeah, and I'll endeavour to do the council view rather than the Rob Scott view, based on the conversations that we've had, to take that into account if that situation does arise. I don't see it happening with these ones. Christine?
I agree with Julie. Just are you going to go on to talk about the emails we've been receiving from
I am. Yep.
members?
Yep.
Right.
That's,
Okay.
that's
Thank
next
you.
on my list. Yep.
Yep.
Cool. So yeah, good lead
Yeah.
into the next part. Sorry, did someone else have something?
Oh, I was just going to check, Rob, are you still on remits or do you want me to log off?
No, still, it's not a
Okay.
remit, but it's still, yeah. If you're happy to hang around for this, for Betty, that'd be cool. So it's and it's going to come across your desk at some stage for Booty as well. We received over the weekend a number of emails via the Taxpayer Union around what they purported as a secret that they'd uncovered from LGNZ, who are doing this secret act of challenging rates capping, which isn't quite accurate in terms of the information that the Taxpayers Union put out. So for a bit of context for everyone, so LGNZ have decided at this AGM, because it's such a big piece of work, they want to sense check the audience to see if councils are comfortable